Cool. So Mark McCormick, Director of Strategic Communications here at the ACLU of Kansas. You and I went on a little bit of a road trip last week. I didn't know if I thought maybe we'd break that down and just talk a little bit about it. We're going to throw here soon to an interview with Stephanie Byers. But
now, was this the trip to Vegas or was this the trip to Wichita?
I thought we weren't talking about the Vegas one.
Oh, well, that has to stay in Vegas, right?
Okay. That's right. That's the after hours one. Okay. No, but maybe next episode.
Yeah, I just broke the first rule of Fight Club. No, it was a fantastic trip, and I really enjoy listening to Stephanie Byers. This is a very insightful person. And in that conversation, shared a lot of the difficulty she had participating in discussions about the NDO.
Mm-hmm. And you were part of those discussions too. I mean, I think that's what was really interesting about it too, is you were in the room where it happened. I didn't mean to slip into a Hamilton quote there, but I mean, here we are. But I mean, tell me a little bit about like kind of your feelings and why you had circled. I think you had a couple of conversations with Representative Byers at that point when you guys were discussing the non-discrimination ordinance.
Well, the Kansas Leadership Center had been tapped to moderate the discussion. Mm-hmm. Having worked there for almost 3 years, I kind of understood that one of the competencies of leadership that they talk about is staying in diagnosis long enough so that you understand precisely what is on the table.
Sure.
Before you start launching into solutions. In that respect, I understood the idea of focusing intensely on the wording in the ordinance, mm-hmm. and trying to surface any questions that there might be about how to improve it, mm-hmm. Or maybe what needed to be trimmed. I understood that part. There was an aspect of the facilitation that did bother me in the respect that, and this was something that Stephanie shared in the discussion with us, that there were our friends in the LGBTQ community in the middle of this discussion where there were people in opposition to the passage of the ordinance. Mm-hmm. The folks who were part of the LGBTQ community felt as though they were asking permission to simply exist in the society. They felt that they themselves were actual stakeholders in this debate. And the discussions at times took on a very emotional tone, something that I understood and something that I empathized with. I've been in situations where I was having a discussion with someone and I didn't feel like they fully understood what they were asking me to do in terms of participating in such a discussion. And there was an aspect of that I felt like many people there who were hurt by the discussion, those were things that I could really understand.
Yeah. Well, and it was, like I said, I think you were the one that kind of circled that we should connect with Stephanie. We also, I'll tease a little bit that we connected with Tabitha Lehman, and she had a lot of really interesting insight on elections and that side of things. So that'll be coming up here soon for anyone that's following along at home. But it was, I think we were both really, impressed and moved and really enjoyed our time with Stephanie. It's funny, at one point there, I was telling you about my last trip to Wichita, saying like, oh, this is only my second time here. And you're like, oh, when did you come here before? And I said, last time when I interviewed Stephanie. So that's been my draw to Wichita so far. So and it's been worthy. So I just was going to ask you to give a little bit. We're going to jump in here in just a second here. We're just running real quick, but to the full interview or a big chunk of it. But just what your takeaway from our time with her, and maybe your favorite part or your favorite thing that she said. I think I have an idea what one of those might be.
One of the things that impresses me most about Stephanie is she can look at a situation and then kind of cut right to what the point is. she has a way of finding the common denominator in the discussion. And she did that in our conversations. And frankly, after those public discussions at the Leadership Center, when we spoke after the meeting, she kind of zeroed in on what she thought went well and what she thought really needed improvement. It was fun to see how her mind worked and how observant she is and how she's able to really focus in on what really matters here. And for anybody who watches this portion of the interview, I'm thinking they're going to come away feeling the same thing.
Yeah, no doubt. Awesome. Well, thank you for your time, Mark. Here we'll toss it to, you'll hear Mark asking the questions and our interview with Stephanie Byers.
Well, thank you.
Because there were so many towns like Foley where my people are from. Are you ready to get started? I enjoy talking to you. So.
Well, we can talk forever.
There were a couple of things we wanted to cover. One, a debrief on the NDO discussion.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of the NDO itself as a document?
I think the NDO itself, the history on it, I guess, is when we looked at the first NDO that was proposed, it was toothless. It had nothing to it that would give a reason for a person to have to abide by the document. It was based upon the NDO that was first presented to Topeka, and it wrongfully assumed that those, for lack of a better word, those punitive side of things were contained within the Kansas Act Against Discrimination and against, within the federal standards and the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission and in the Department of Housing, et cetera. It didn't realize that the current interpretations, especially dealing with groups that people who are marginalized in the areas of gender identity or sexual orientation, they're not included within those groups as far as law goes, but are there by interpretation based upon the Gorsuch Supreme Court decision in Bostick versus Clayton County. And so when we first got involved with it, and I worked in hand with Equality Kansas, with Tom Witt, with Carrie Wilkes, we were looking at it and how we can put teeth into that, and bringing the ACLU in, helping to write amendments that would create a document that actually had some type of enforcement mechanism. And so when we first saw that one, the city council referred to, there were two different amendments proposed. One was called the Cadillac Plan, the other one was called the Honda Plan. The Cadillac Plan would have allowed Wichita to create a human rights commission of their own that would have overseen how this worked. The Cadillac Plan was very inclusive. I think it created a lot of things, but was also going to be more problematic as far as getting through the council. The Honda Plan looked at the court system that Wichita already has, put in a system of fines and a graduated system, so if there's repeated offenses, the fines would go up. And that was the one that was originally voted for a second read, but then was passed off to the city attorneys and asked them to really bring that document into the language that it needs to have to be legally enforceable. When the city attorneys got done with theirs, the document that's presented is extremely similar to the Non-Discrimination Ordinance that is in place with Overland Park, very similar to the one that's in place with Roland Park. And we know that Overland Park and Roland Park are related to each other and how the documents evolved. And they've been in place for 7-8 years, so we've seen them in action. And so when you look at the actual document, there's a lot of legalese to it, but most of that legalese is based upon precedent, so we understand how it's going to work. It's good. There is one hang-up with it that was rightly brought out by one of our city councilors, and that if you choose to file a complaint of discrimination, the first step is mediation. And each party, both the person who feels they've been discriminated against and the person they're filing a complaint against, both of those parties have to split the cost of mediation. So if you are, an employee who is making minimum wage, feels discriminated against, are you going to have the financial resources to share the cost of mediation? And so it seemed like nobody was really looking at that. So I took it on myself to reach out to Kansas Legal Services and look at what they do, and found out very quickly, even on their website, that they do a sliding scale based on income for mediation for the Kansas Human Rights Commission. So when we have those state level discriminatory charges filed, the claims filed, that there is already a process in place for someone who may not have the money to be able to reach out and have that assistance. And so I also then reached out to our vice mayor, and I said, this is not proper for me to go to Kansas Legal Services as a state representative, because this is a city issue. But you as vice mayor, or even if we get the city manager, someone to reach out and see if the Kansas Legal Services would be willing to extend that same benefit through the city of Wichita. And I have a friend who's an attorney with them, although she's a new hire, so she's not really the person to say, but she's pretty sure that Kansas Legal Services would be willing to do that. And since they're based out of Hutchinson, it's not like it would cause a real strong delay, because we're talking 40 miles up the road. We're not talking about having to go halfway across the state. And so to me, that's the one area that was problematic. And here we have a solution, for that one area.
But overall, you think it's a good bill or law, or
It seems like it's a well thought out ordinance.
ordinance.
And-
That's the word I was looking for.
And the fact that it's been in place, it's had some time to prove itself.
Given that, do you understand at all why it's controversial for some people?
For me, on a personal level, I try to remind people that, although I'm an elected official, I am not a lawyer. As we joke about quite often, I'm much more comfortable telling people that as a former band director, it's second valve than I am trying to explain the legal ramifications on things. But as a member of the LGBTQ community, and hearing all of this testimony that's come out through the city council meetings, through the Kansas Leadership Center's focus groups, and even the Diversity, Inclusion, and Civil Rights Advisory Board, the hang-up comes over and over again around SOGI, the sexual orientation and gender identity components. Everything is good, and we hear that positive. The only maybe negative comment that we have heard comes from those with disabilities who are saying, Wichita has run behind in its enforcement of the American with Disabilities Act, that we need to step it up, and that this ordinance would help bring that on forward. But when we hear opposition, it really comes down to sexual orientation and gender identity. And within that, 95% of the comments come down to gender identity. So much.
A lot of what ifs.
A lot of what ifs. A lot of what ifs. And a lot of fear mongering.
What do you feel like to be in the room for those sessions?
It hurts. When I was a kid, and a lot of us have heard this, the old saying that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That's not really true. And I don't mean hurt as in an emotional thing. After I sat through 3.5 hours of testimony at a city council meeting where it was one person after another basically saying my very existence was an abomination, my bones hurt. For the next 2 days, my body ached. And, it's those words, you carry them in you. And it's on things that maybe we don't necessarily understand. As we were starting this conversation earlier and talking about my Native American heritage, I've had that experience as a Native American. I've been told as hair so dark it was almost black, eyes so dark they were almost black, dark brown skin going into a restroom in southwestern United States in the 60s that I wasn't allowed to use the gentleman's gas station bathroom. You know, my dad was told, because we were, quote, Injun. And he added, I'm sure that you guys are really nice people, but I just don't let Injuns use my bathroom. They come in and tear the place up. And then to add to that insult, looked at my mom and said to my dad, your wife, she white? She can use my bathroom. But you and the kids, I just won't let you.
You know, it was tough for me to sit in that room, particularly the first night. The second night, all my questions just started to come out. And I was hoping to spark more of a conversation. Subsequent conversations with people who were running the focus group did not understand what you were just saying. They did not understand how painful or how hurtful it was. And I thought I could help them understand this by saying I was covering an event at a Chick-fil-A in Springfield, Missouri, back in like 2012. And as you know, Chick-fil-A is an opponent of LGBTQ rights. And they had sponsored some event at the store, and the parking, there must have been 200 or 300 people in the parking lot and in the store. And I was talking to a pastor who pastored a church for LGBTQ people. And she had tears in her eyes, and she said, nobody understands what it must feel like to have people show up like this to protest a person's existence. That story kind of bounced off like bullets bounce off Superman's chest. One of the things that Jesse and I were hoping to do with this video is if you could articulate for people like that who don't understand how it must have felt to be in the room for those discussions.
I think for people within the community, and when I refer to the community, I'm talking about the LGBTQ community, and in particular, those folks who are transgender. Our language, we use terms and stuff like that, it resonates with each other because we have these similar experiences. To try to move that to someone who the sex they were assigned at birth and their gender identity have aligned their entire life, it's a difficult thing to do because they don't necessarily see things the same way. One of the first things we run into is this concept that my being transgender was my choice. I didn't make that decision. This is who I am. I will tell people that me being transgender is no different than the fact that my eyes are as deep brown as they are. You know, it's no different than Paul and Dorothy are my parents. I didn't make these choices. This is what was handed to me. And being transgender was something that was handed to me. And it's a hard thing to understand. It's hard for people who are transgender to understand. We just know who we are, we accept ourselves for who we are, and we try to just live our existence. And when we walk into a room like city council chambers and we're discussing this non-discrimination ordinance and we come down to that, it doesn't resonate with people who are against extending those protections to the people who are transgender, that we're talking about protecting someone just because of who they are. Not a choice that they made, not a decision that they made, not a lifestyle that they've taken on.
You know, media used lifestyle for a lot of years.
Yeah. And, you know, within the community, we joke about it. You know, here's our lifestyle. On Saturday, we mow the yard, click. You know, we go grocery shopping. You know, that's our lifestyle. But it's turned into this weapon. And so you have these arguments that are apples and oranges. So we're arguing about our existence, our right to fundamental things. We're not asking that there be a special neighborhood set aside with reduced interest rates just for the transgender community to move into. We're asking that when we look at accommodations and in housing, that trans people have the same right to rent as a cisgender person does. That someone who is in a same-sex relationship has the same right to rent that duplex as a opposite sex relationship does.
What do you say to the people who feel like any advancement in LGBTQ rights equals some sort of subtraction of rights for them?
You know, it's trite, but it's true. Rights are not pizza. Rights are more like love. There's always more love to go around. You know, I come from a large family, right? I've got 5 younger siblings. With each, I'm the oldest. With each additional sibling, my parents didn't take love away from me. They just added love to the next person that came in. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about rights. We're talking about just expanding that out. You're not going to lose something, you know, and I think sometimes people are trying to hang on to something that they never actually had. And they view that as losing a right. You know, we live in a country where it wasn't safe to be outwardly LGBT for most of my life. I mean, I was born in 1963, and we're talking about Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that just was reinterpreted by Bostick versus Clayton County to say that on the basis of sex does indeed include sexual orientation and gender identity.
This was a violent place into the 80s and 90s.
Yes. Yes.
It definitely was.
And, you know, the folks that were able to have the courage to be able to live authentically and present themselves out in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, and the 90s, you know, we celebrate them. But we also know that they were taking their lives in their own hands. You know, it resonates with me when I began to run for office that Harvey Milk was assassinated. And that there are still people like that out here that think that I should not breathe, let alone that I should not be recognized for the gender that I am. But there's fewer people like that.
It feels like there are people who feel like that is so in the name of Christianity. I'd be curious how you feel about how we reconcile these sort of civic questions when so much of our civic discussion is mired in religiosity.
I think religiosity is a good term because to me that's different than faith. And I am a person of faith. My religious upbringing is a part of my life. My soul is a part of my life. I go to church. You know, people are sometimes surprised to find out that people who are LGBTQ can be people of faith. A lot of us are not in the same places as far as the churches we attend that we grew up in. I grew up literally in the Church of Christ, so very conservative. You know, probably mostly known for not having instruments in their worship services. And people would always look at me a long time ago and say, how can you be a band director and yet you grew up in a church without instruments? I'm like, yeah, but you should hear me sing. But, you know, even the churches of Christ are turning. Some of them are becoming more accepting. Even here in Wichita, we have churches that are opening their doors for people who are part of the LGBTQ community. We also have churches of Christ that are closing those doors. And so, you know, that's no longer my faith community, but I still have a faith community. I think that some people look at their religious liberties, their freedom of religion, and don't realize it's not as expansive as they think that it is. And even if you look at it from a biblical basis, Jesus prays, don't take them out of the world, just don't let them be of the world. So to me, that says that if you're going to do business in this world, you do business with everybody. You treat everybody with that same dignity and respect that we're asking for in the Non-Discrimination Ordinance. Does that change the way that you have to believe? No. But that's where we start to understand that this is not, as I've said a few times, this is our city. It's not a church. And if you feel like you've got to have that sincerely held religious belief that you will not serve the LGBTQ community, then call yourself a club, sell memberships. Don't make yourself a public
Is that our
business.
primary issue? Where religion is colliding with civil liberties and civil rights, it just seems like there was a speaker at a seminar I was at, and he was quoting Sandra Day O'Connor, and Sandra Day O'Connor was worried that if someone could figure out how to apply a religious exclusion to a certain kind of racism, that she felt like it would be bulletproof. And right after Brown, we kind of underestimated the resolve of people who wanted to keep this society separate. They started filing lawsuits, they started picketing schools, but then they also started establishing private Christian academies. Mm-hmm. And you taught it, North. Our schools are more segregated today than they were around Brown. Is that our primary, is that where the two faults meet over who we want to be civically versus who large portions of the society wants to be religiously? Do you find that the people who are the strongest opponents of LGBTQ rights are religious people?
I find that those strongest opponents call themselves religious people. And part of this is just my own faith stance. If someone asks me, are you a Christian? I might answer yes, because that's kind of the convenience that we have. We understand how that is. But honestly, I don't want to say I'm a Christian. I would much rather think that my life is lived in such a manner that you would apply that term to me. And in my understanding of the Bible, when the believers were first called Christian, they weren't the ones that put that name out there. It was because of who they were. But that's not the world we live in. And so we have people that take that name on. And I'm no theologian.
Orthodoxy, and then there's a praxis.
Yes. And I'm no theologian. I went to a Christian university. I'm 3 hours short of a minor in Bible, to be honest. But I scream at these people inside my heart, like, open up your book and read it. Read Mark 7, and where Jesus tells the Pharisees, you say this is Corban. This is set aside for God. Apply it to now. Is this what you're saying about your business? That you're using that expression, I have a sincerely held religious belief, not because of the fact that it's going to make a difference in your business, but because of the fact that you're prejudiced and you want to use that as your rationale for remaining in a state where you can openly practice discrimination. Is that what's going on? Those are the things that I start to think about. And it does get frustrating because I'm like, y'all, I have the same Bible that you do, and why do you not read beyond?
After that meeting, I had a conversation with Kendall. Mm-hmm. Kendall suggested 2 meetings, maybe 3. One talking about the true stakeholders. Another meeting with others who maybe had what I call grievance envy,
Mm-hmm.
and then maybe a third for people who want to come together and talk. Would that have been a better way to move forward?
It's hard to know because I don't know somebody else's heart on this. But I think that a meeting of the folks that you know are listed as those protected classes to talk together, to say how are you being served by this community now? What can we do to improve that service? I think that would be a good thing. I think that one of the things that we see is we do have people, and we heard this over and over again, people say, I don't have anything against the LGBTQ, but, and I think that we would still have that. That there is this false dichotomy of it's this or this, but we can compromise. Well, how do you compromise on human rights?
That's what I was getting at before. So I was like, how is this controversial? Would we be neutral about what happened to Matthew Shepard? Would we be neutral about Emmett Till or the little girls who got bombed in their church in Sunday school? It just seems like being neutral on equal rights seems so antithetical to who we are.
You know, and it's easy for us to sit there and say, we would not be this way on Matthew Shepard. However, just this summer, I read someone's post out on social media that said people leave out the fact that Matthew Shepard was dealing drugs and blah, 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 blah. And you're like, what? You know, we heard on that, I don't remember if it was the first night or the second night of the KLC meeting, about the hundreds of cases pending of trans women attacking, but you can't find that anywhere except for the same ideological bubble of news. It doesn't go anywhere else. And, you know, I don't know. To me, when we got to this point with the second read and the current adoption of this NDO that the city's trying to, the proposed NDO, what keeps ringing out in my ears is that someone's going to propose a compromise. And the compromise they're going to propose is that we include sexual orientation, but we don't include gender identity. Even to the point of hearing...
Capitulation of people who are not actually stakeholders.
Yep. And those of us that are transgender are such a small part of the population. We don't have that loud of a voice. We have to rely on our allies to amplify our voices. Because, and we know this is why we are understudied. We know this is why we face healthcare disparities. We know why this is why people who are transgender have a higher rate of unemployment than people who are not, have a higher rate of homelessness. We understand that because those of us that are able to be that voice are few in number, you know?
One of the best arguments I heard was from my pastor in Louisville, who used to say, you know, when God created us, he wasn't guilty of creative malfeasance.
Exactly.
I mean, that'd be a great answer to some of our Christian friends. It occurred to me in our throughout the conversation that the word I was really looking for was empathy. I don't find a lot of modern mainstream Protestant Christians full of empathy. To me, that would be the antidote to a lot of what we've been experiencing. But to shift gears a little bit, our mutual friend Tom Witt was not just full of empathy, but was really effective in getting other people to see and understand that. Can you talk a little bit about how you got to know Tom, or what some of his best attributes are and what he's brought to the state?
Tom and I know each other initially through a common friend. One of his better friends was a band parent, and when I began living authentically, she lit up, immediately went to Tom and said, guess what? We have a teacher, not just any teacher. You know, this is the person that's the band director at one of the largest high schools in the state of Kansas. And that's how.
The greatest school in Kansas.
Well, yeah. Mascot changes aside. But, and as I told my students when we were talking about it years ago, I said, the name's not important, it's the spirit of the school that's what's important. And I always hang on to that. But Tom likes to think of himself as a curmudgeon. He isn't. He has the biggest heart. And I think part of that curmudgeonly, anyway, part of that is because his heart is so big he has to protect himself. But he gets to the root of things. So in this, Tom and I have been friends since 2015. And I know there are people in the state that have been friends with him for far longer and would probably be better suited for talking about him. But when we were staring at legislation coming up in February that would have banned affirmative health care for trans kids, Tom was the first one to pull us all together and say, we have to get out on this. We have to talk about this now. They don't know what they're doing. They don't understand. And we immediately went into the press pool in the state capitol building, and the day the bill was filed, on the bill that would have banned girls who happen to be trans from participating in athletics and affirming their gender that way, when that came through, Tom's one who said it has nothing to do with scoring points. It's not about shooting free throws. It's not about kicking goals. This has to do with someone's right to exist. And those are the things that he fights for. And every time when these things comes up, he feels it in his soul. And he'll tell you he's not a person who's a believer. But I've seen this man's soul, and it's huge. But it's full of holes because he's been taking punch after punch on these things. And, he has the ability to look beyond the obvious, to see what's going on underneath. He is persistent. And he also looks for ways to create those relationships that you might not think should exist. Because he does find and work and talk with people. To talk with him about his history at the state capitol and how his job as a lobbyist, how those relationships evolved over the years is a very amazing thing.
This goes back to what you said at the beginning, that the perception is that these are choices that you've made.
Right.
And particularly people on the right they ride really hard on personal responsibility and personal accountability. And I think what you said at the beginning really speaks to this point.
Yes. And for me, as a person of faith, to hear all these supposed faith-based arguments breaks my heart. I mean, my living authentically is based upon my faith. Based upon my Lord saying, I want you to walk in the light, not in the darkness. Now, how do I do that unless I bring myself to the light? Knowing who I am and letting everybody else see that. I want your yes be yes and your no be no. I want you to be truthful. Well, here's the truth. I'm Stephanie Byers. I'm a woman. I have known it my entire life. That's the truth.